You're watching Northern Crimes.
The Molalla Forest, a vast wilderness area spanning over 60,000 acres in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. It's known for its rugged terrain, picturesque landscapes, and an array of abundant wildlife. But in the 1980s, it became infamous for something far more evil. It was the hunting ground of Dayton Leroy Rogers, a prolific serial killer who terrorized the area for years, leaving a trail of death, destruction, and paralyzing fear. This is Northern Crimes.
The material we're going to discuss this morning is very disturbing, and we will have some pictures that are considered graphic. Do you remember Dayton Leroy Rogers?
Who can forget him?
He was considered Oregon's worst serial killer. He brutalized, he tortured, he abused women for about 15 years until his bloodlust just took over and he started killing prostitutes. He started killing women, and it wasn't until the 8th woman was killed that he was actually apprehended.
Dayton Rogers is one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of Oregon. Between the years of 1983 to 1987, he murdered at least 7 women, mostly street workers and drug addicts, in a brutal and sadistic manner. Rogers had a chilling routine. He'd scour the streets for prostitutes, lure them into his car, then drive them to a desolate area. There he would bind them tightly, silencing their cries, before ruthlessly assaulting and killing them. His sinister pattern repeated again and again, with each victim meeting a gruesome fate. He was known as the Molalla Forest Killer, and his reign of terror left the shocked state of Oregon reeling. But who was Dayton Leroy Rogers, and what led him to commit such heinous crimes? Dayton Leroy Rogers was born in Moscow, Idaho, in 1953. He grew up in a working-class family and, by all accounts, had a relatively normal childhood. However, there were signs that all was not well. He was a loner, often withdrawn and moody. He had a tendency to get in trouble with the law, and he displayed deviant behavior that worried his family. In 7th grade, he was arrested for shooting a BB gun at passing cars. As Dayton grew older, his behavior became more erratic. He dropped out of school, and he drifted from job to job. He had a string of failed relationships, and he began to spend more and more time in the Molalla Forest. For Dayton, the forest was a place of refuge, a place where he could escape from the pressures of society, but it was also a place where he could indulge his darkest fantasies. In 1972, at the age of 18, Rogers committed his first known attack. Hoping for a romantic encounter with his girlfriend, he drove her to a secluded area just outside Eugene, Oregon. There, he assaulted her and, out of nowhere, stabbed her in the abdomen. After taking her to the hospital, he was arrested and sentenced to 4 years probation. But his behaviors only escalated. The following year, Rogers assaulted 2 teenage girls in the Lane County area, attacking them with a glass bottle. For this, he was institutionalized at the Oregon State Mental Hospital. After his release in 1974, Rogers met and married a woman named Sherry Miller, and after 7 months of dating, they got married. But marriage couldn't curb his inner demons, and in December 1975, Rogers was arrested and indicted, this time on suspicion of rape. But in a twist of fate, the jury found him not guilty. Then, in 1977, he was again charged with rape. this time pleading innocent by reason of insanity. Dayton was convicted, but only received a 5-year jail sentence. In his closing remarks, the state prosecutor was quoted as saying, "Dayton Leroy Rogers is a murder waiting to happen." It's difficult to understand how a monster like Dayton Leroy Rogers could slip through the cracks again and again. Perhaps it was simple chance, but oddly enough, his curious luck is similar to another serial killer from Alaska, Robert Hansen, who was let out of prison again and again, only to murder 17 women in the wilderness of Alaska. Whatever the case, Dayton Rogers was released from prison in 1982. In hindsight, this would be a calculation with terrible consequences. On August 7th, 1987, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, patrons at a Denny's restaurant in Clackamas County heard the terrified screams of a woman. One of the witnesses ran toward the source of the wailing, but as he got closer, the cries stopped. It was then that he observed a man, bloody knife in hand, standing between the woman's legs. When the witness yelled at the man, he took off running, got into a pickup truck, and fled the scene. The witness called the police, then began attending to the injured woman, who was naked, bleeding heavily, with labored breathing. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and transported the woman to the hospital. Meanwhile, another patron from the restaurant had followed the knife-wielding attacker to his home, writing down his license plate. Back at the hospital, the woman, who had been identified as 25-year-old Jennifer Smith, tragically died from her severe wounds. Shortly thereafter, police arrived at the door of the attacker and arrested him. His name was Dayton Leroy Rogers. Over the next few weeks, police conducted an investigation of the murder of Jennifer Smith. The night of the murder, they had recovered the murder weapon, which Rogers had thrown to the ground during his escape. In subsequent searches of his house and the shop where he worked, police uncovered a trove of evidence, including a hacksaw, boots with blood on them, burned women's clothing, miniature vodka bottles, as well as multiple bloodstains in his house, the workshop, and his vehicle. Police wondered what all this evidence could mean. It would take them just a few short weeks to find out. On August 31st, 1987, a bow hunter walking through the Molalla Forest discovered a woman's body beneath some matted ferns. He immediately called police and later took them to the corpse. Over the course of the following week, the bodies of 6 more women were found in the same general area. All the bodies were naked and in various stages of decomposition. During autopsies, the medical examiner estimated that the bodies had been in the forest for 1 to 3 months. The women were identified as follows: Retha Marie Giles, age 16, Lisa Marie Mock, age 23, Nandus Noni K. Cervantes, age 26, Cynthia Dee Diane DeVore, age 24, Christine Lotus Adams, age 35, and Maureen Ann Hodge, age 26. A 7th victim could not be identified. The injuries were horrific, with commonalities between the victims being strangulation, stab wounds in the back, and feet cut off above the ankles. Other evidence at the dump site included orange juice in vodka bottles, a knife with human tissue on it, as well as several items that had been tied into knots, including pantyhose, shoelaces, rope, and cloth. It didn't take police long to realize that Dayton Rogers was most likely the killer. In February 1988, while the state's investigation of the Molalla Forest killings continued, Rogers was indicted, tried, and convicted for aggravated murder for causing the death of Jennifer Smith. He was sentenced to life in prison. During the guilt phase of that trial, the court refused to permit the introduction of evidence regarding the Molalla Forest victims, but investigators hoped that they could deal with that later. Shortly thereafter, Rogers was indicted for the killings of the 6 identified Molalla Forest victims. He was charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder for each of the victims, and this time, the state would seek the death penalty. During the second trial, which began in March 1989, the state presented evidence that the 6 Molalla Forest victims were prostitutes. So they offered the testimony of 11 other prostitutes who had, quote, dated Rogers. The witnesses testified about Rogers' conduct during their encounters with him, and it was devastating. They talked about his habit of mixing vodka from miniature bottles into small plastic orange juice containers. Several of the witnesses testified that Rogers took them to areas in or near the Molalla Forest. They also testified about his violent sexual proclivities, including tying their hands and feet tightly behind them, threatening to cut their breasts and feet with a knife, and deceiving them about his intentions concerning their, quote, dates. Eventually, the jury convicted Rogers on all counts of the 6 indictments. On Wednesday, June 7, 1989, the jury unanimously decided that Rogers had intentionally killed his victims without provocation, and that he would continue to pose a threat to society. The judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection. In the United States, the death penalty is a contentious topic. It's not uncommon for criminals that are sentenced to death to eventually have those sentences overturned, and that's exactly what happened to Dayton Leroy Rogers. In 2000, the Oregon Supreme Court upheld his convictions, but his sentence of death was overturned. Since that time, Rogers has come before the court many times, each time the state hoping to reinstate the death penalty, and each time failing. Ultimately, Rogers received a 4th death sentence, but again, the wheels of justice spun too slow. Recently, Governor Kate Brown signed a new law limiting aggravating factors needed for the death penalty, leading to the overturning of Rogers' death sentence on November 12, 2021. Governor Brown later commuted all death sentences in Oregon to life without parole on December 13, 2022. As recently as 2022, families of the victims continue to seek justice for their loved ones, but as of yet, Dayton Leroy Rogers continues to serve out his life sentence at Two Rivers Correctional Institution in Umatilla. Rogers has never spoken with authorities about the murders, and he continues to hold the secrets of what he knows deep within himself. It's hard to come to terms with the savagery of serial killers like Dayton Leroy Rogers. Maybe we'll never understand his motives. But what we can do is honor the innocent human beings that lost their lives.